So we talked about the back it up, stack it up. Now let's see, what does that have to do with your breathing and your pelvic floor? All right, so I've got my two bowls. This bottom bowl is going to represent my pelvis. And then this top bowl is going to represent, as best I can align them, my rib cage. And we want them, as we talked about, backed up and stacked up. So when we're going, I'll talk about my normal habit. When I'm in my normal habit of a big anterior tip, so here I am nice and stacked, but my natural habit is this. So when I push my hips forward and tip my pelvis forward, the bowl of my pelvis is now spilling forward, and my ribs are now flaring out. And then some of us go the other way. Some of us are tail tuckers and rib droppers. And so now this front body is more closed, but the back body is more open. So why does that matter? It's really about your diaphragm and your pelvic floor. So your diaphragm is this dome-like muscle that when you inhale, it contracts to draw the breath in, to open your lungs. It draws the lungs down. Air comes in, your rib cage opens, so your diaphragm drops and spreads, this dome-like muscle. Now everything between your diaphragm and the pelvic floor gently gets pushed down into the pelvic floor, not in a forceful way, just a natural way, and the pelvic floor muscles get a little stretch. And then when you exhale, the diaphragm domes and the pelvic floor has a little bit of lift. Not a Kegel, just a natural movement. The pelvic floor, many of us think is this kind of stuck thing. It has fluctuation. And so your diaphragm and pelvic floor work together. I like to think of them like little jellyfish dancing together. So you inhale, the diaphragm drops, the pelvic floor spreads. You exhale, the diaphragm domes, the pelvic floor has a little lift. Now, let's take that knowledge into the ribs and your pelvis. Remember, we need the pelvic floor to be responsive. It should have movement. It should be springy. We don't want it so overlaxed or so tight. It should be, if you've ever jumped on a trampoline, you jump down, you spring up. You jump down, you spring up. If you try to jump on a trampoline that was hard, it wouldn't feel great on your spine. You need the trampoline to be responsive to that downward pressure. Same thing with the pelvic floor. So we get the best results of your pelvic floor being balanced when we have that back it up, stack it up. So that when your diaphragm from your rib cage goes straight down, we want that to be even with your pelvis. So all 360 degrees of your diaphragm, that pressure naturally goes into the 360 degrees of your pelvis. So you can start to think, all right, what happens if I'm tipping my pelvis forward, my ribs out? So now the diaphragm right here is going more forward. And that can wreak havoc in several ways. One, I'm now putting intra-abdominal pressure into that center line of your abdomen. And when you're pregnant, we often hear about that linea alba, that connective tissue in your center line. It's already spreading and thinning, and we're putting more pressure into that. But we're also missing some of that direct pressure down into your pelvic floor. And so then the pelvic floor is not going to be even. So if the pressure's going forward, the back part of your pelvic floor isn't getting that even fluctuation. If we think of like pistons, they're moving together. Now, if I tip one of those pistons forward, I have that pressure forward, and this bottom one's not getting that pressure. So now we can end up with tightness in your pelvic floor. All right, so what do? Again, we come back to that back it up and stack it up to bring awareness. But now we also want to work on opening your back ribs. Because if your ribs are coming forward, we tend to be less mobile in your back ribs. And so now I'm not getting that full expansion, and I'm not letting the pelvic floor get into that posterior part of the pelvic floor. Remember, if you're a tail tucker, then we tend to already be gripping that posterior part of the pelvic floor. So we want all 360 degrees of the rib cage to be open for the diaphragm to get its natural release down, all 360 degrees, and then the whole pelvic floor to be the recipient of that natural downward pressure.